Radiation is a valuable asset in the sterilization of materials, and because of this, hundreds of facilities across the world harness radioisotopes from irradiating food, equipment, and even blood. But history has shown that these facilities are often overlooked when it comes to maintenance, funding, and training. This is because they offer little risk to the outside world, in the same way that a facility that regularly assembles critical assemblies or a nuclear reactor does. An industrial sterilization facility in Nesvizh, Belarus, would become centre stage in the early 1990s for an overexposure event which would result in death. The story would follow a similar route to other incidents, where an operator would enter an irradiation room when it was certainly not safe to do so. However, what is different in this event was that the facility had multiple features that should have stopped an exposure event, and on the day they were actually working, and the operator was highly qualified, meaning they had to actively avoid these safety measures. My name is John, and today we're looking at the Nesvizh radiological accident. It is 1981 and a new facility is being planned for use at the biochemical plant of the Pharma Industry Corporation in Nesvizh, USSR, modern-day Belarus. It is going to be built by the All-Union Scientific Research Institute of Radiation Technology of the USSR and is designed to a standard set out by Soviet regulatory authorities. It is intended to irradiate peat for use in fertilizers and makes use of gamma radiation from an original capacity of 6.72 petabecquerels of cobalt-60. 3 years after conception, the site would become operational in 1984, but would undergo a significant refurbishment in 1989, where the capacity would be upped by over 3 times to 30 petabecquerels. Along with the greater reactivity of its source, the plant was further modified to irradiate other materials, such as medical equipment. The design of the facility is of a papal model type, and is different to what we've seen on this channel so far when it comes to irradiation plants. Whilst we're here, let's take a look at the papal irradiation system. There are a number of differences to, say, a Western irradiation machine. The first is the way that the source is stored when out of use. Instead of a pool, the radioactive material is in a shielded dry storage pit. However, the system still makes use of gravity in that when in use the source is raised out of its pit, and in the event of a power outage or safety system trip, the source is dropped into a safe position. Another difference from, say, an Atomic Energy of Canada Limited design is the way the products to be irradiated are given their sweet dose of radiation. Instead of pistons, rollers and conveyors, the products are rotated at a constant rate around the source in a transport container suspended from an overhead rail. The whole irradiation room is surrounded by concrete shielding up to 1.8 meters thick, and like many other facilities, entry is via an area called the maze. The maze here is far more intricate than other facilities I've looked at, and this is primarily due to its pretty impressive safety systems that are aimed at preventing and mitigating the risks from an unauthorized entry. The first reminds me of something from an Indiana Jones movie. When the source rack is in the radiation or up position, a section of the floor at the entrance to the maze is driven back by a motor to reveal a deep pit. The only usable ledge is on top of the motor housing itself. This acts as a physical barrier to entry, but it isn't all there is. Further down the maze hallway is a full width pressure plate, too big to be jumped across. If stepped on, then the source rack will be lowered. The source is made up of a rack of pencils and spacers. Each pencil can have as much as 70 terabecquerels of radioactivity. Control of the facility is done at a panel in the control room next to the loading bay for the transport system. From here, operators can control the source and the transport mechanism, as well as the gamma monitoring system. The gamma monitoring system is interlocked to the control panel. If either of the two monitors outside the room take a reading that exceeds 40 microsieverts an hour, then the rack is dropped into the pit. During operation, the product transport system of material to be irradiated is monitored from its control panel. This has illuminated signals that are triggered by microswitches along the track. The first hint of a product jam is if a light doesn't illuminate in sequence. This requires the operators to remain vigilant from a radiation dose point of view, as if the product is held in position for too long, it can damage it. But unlike the gamma monitors, the transport system is not interlocked with the source rack, and thus, if there is a jam, then it is solely down to the operator to make the irradiation room safe by dropping the rack via the source down button. Now, before we get onto the fateful event, we need to mention the correct procedure for entering the irradiation room, as no matter the amount of safety systems you can have, proper control of staff actions can be the difference between life or death. To gain entry to the facility, an operator must first push the down button on the control panel. This illuminates the down light until the micro switches sense the irradiator is fully down. The operator is then required to wait 4 minutes. Then the key on the control panel should be turned from the ready to the off position and then removed. Then the dose rate is monitored from the gamma probes. If at an acceptable level, they must check their portable dose rate monitor on a test source attached to it. The key has to be taken to the maze entrance panel, where it is inserted and turned to the on position. That moves the motorized floor section to cover the entrance pit. A final check of the portable monitor to see if there are higher than anticipated radiation levels between 0.2 and 0.5 microsieverts an hour when the rack is lowered, and if fully exposed, 3 to 4 microsieverts an hour. Now we know how it's meant to be done, we must now look at the disaster. It is the early hours of Saturday the 26th of October 1991, and 2 workers are operating the Nesvizh radiation facility. This morning the team consisted of the site's most experienced operator and his assistant. The operator was 34 years old, had a degree in engineering and had worked at Nesvizh since the site's construction. He was in the control room reading a newspaper whilst the assistant was on the loading bay loading the product into the carriers. The assistant became aware of a product jam when the motor drive made a noticeable change in noise. He then called out to the operator. The operator pushed the source down button as per the rules, but failed to remove his key before making his way to the maze entrance. Investigators would later speculate that this was to speed up the resumption of operations after the jam was cleared. Without his key, the operator had a problem: how to move the motorized floor to bridge the entrance pit gap. Well, his experience from previous incidents had shown an alternative method of entry. You may remember that I mentioned that the motor housing is the only protruding thing in the entrance pit. As it turns out, it is enough to support the weight of a person, and gives a big enough ledge to step over the gap. Although he was flouting the rules, he did, however, take a portable radiation monitor with him, and next he started to approach the pressure plate. This is where the narrative gets a little bit shaky. The operator post-event was reluctant to tell investigators how he managed to get over the plate without triggering an emergency source down situation. But there are a few theories. One was that he climbed over the plate by grabbing the transport rails. Or he did walk on the plate, but the rack was jammed and thus didn't go into the shielding pit. The final theory was that the rack raised on its own accord. Regardless, the operator made his way into the irradiator room. Upon entry, the transport containers would have obscured his view of the rack, but its counterweights would have been visible, which could have indicated its position. It's unlikely that he realised the position of the rack as he started to clear the obstruction. After approximately 1 minute, he started to experience a headache, and he looked around the room to discover the rack was in the irradiation position. He ran out of the irradiation chamber and told his assistant that he had been exposed. Immediately, telephone calls were made to the local hospital and to the police. Within 20 minutes, an ambulance had arrived on the scene and transported the operator to hospital. Quickly, it was realised after the operator explained what they had been exposed to, that the Nesvizh hospital didn't have the appropriate experience needed to deal with such a patient. He was transferred via Minsk to the clinic at the Biophysics Institute in Moscow for specialised care. Within the first 7 days, bone marrow and gastrointestinal issues started to manifest themselves in the operator. During this period, investigations were made into the dose received during the incident. The operator's clothing was analysed, and this gave an estimate of between 11 and 18 Gray, roughly 3 times a fatal full-body dose. 8 days post-exposure, the patient had started to experience a fever, and 11 days post-exposure, he began to manifest severe skin injuries. Around day 40, his general state was relatively stable, but would start to show symptoms of pneumonia, and his condition would deteriorate. By day 104, he was showing typical acute adult respiratory distress syndrome. The patient's blood pressure decreased on day 112, and sadly, the following day, he would die while in a hypoamic coma caused by respiratory distress. We have to jump back to the day of the disaster, after the exposure and before the operator was transferred to Moscow. Local authorities spoke to him to try and find out how the event played out. The operator was not particularly forthcoming and tried to pass off many questions to feeling tired during his shift and not being able to remember. A government-led investigation looked into the event and concluded that the following facility modifications should be implemented for future safety: enlarging the pit and moving the motor, providing an audible alarm for movement of the source rack within the facility, and providing visible warning signals inside the facility to indicate the position of the source rack. The site's license was suspended until these modifications were implemented, but there was still the looming question. If the operator pressed the source down button, how did the rack go back up in the time between walking from the control room to the entrance of the maze? The rack being jammed seemed unlikely, as no debris was found that could have caused an obstruction. The other cause is likely linked to the fact that the operator did not remove his key, and thus in theory left the system with power. This left the system open to the rack being raised, either from accidental or unnoticed depression of the exposure button, temporary failure of a component in the control circuit, or the logic of the electrical circuits which could have provided power to the lift circuit. The initiating events are all too common with these types of facilities, and that is product jam. This, coupled with the pressures of production targets, has shown to lead operators to undertake reckless actions. If the rules had been followed properly, then the overexposure would have likely not happened. Now, as always, if you want to read more about this event, you can check out the IAEA report. The link will be in the description below. This is a Plain Difficult production. All videos are Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike licensed. Plain Difficult videos are produced by me, John, in a currently sunny southeastern corner of London, UK. Help channel grow by liking, commenting and subscribing. Check out my Twitter for all sorts of photos and odds and sods, as well as hints on future videos. I've got Patreon and YouTube membership as well, so check them out if you fancy supporting the channel financially. And all that's left to say is thank you for watching.